Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tivia Collins. I'm an assistant professor in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department, and I was an EEJI fellow for the 2024-2025 academic year. Now, this fellowship has supported my research and teaching for the year, and it is an honor to share some of that work with you all today. Now, first, my work is focused on specifically the Caribbean region. And this region, I do the work both as it is located as a physical space on a map, as well as the Caribbean as a space that's planted across the globe. Now, this work is very personal to me first, and I'm taking a moment to share with you now that I'm from Guyana, and currently my country is experiencing national unrest. We're in a state of emergency as Guyanese take to the streets demanding justice for an 11-year-old girl, Adriana, who went missing and was later found dead, and there's no support in the country to say what has happened to her. So speaking with you here today, and I'll be talking about environmental injustice, I want to note the connections between all kinds of injustices that exist across the globe. Specifically here, for as we think about environmental catastrophe and those kinds of violences, I want to note that all oppression is connected, and we must always remember that the living must chant for the dead. Ashe. Ashe. For this fellowship, I engage with work both in the classroom and in my research. So I'll talk to you first about the classroom. This semester, I taught a course called Gender and Migration to 18 undergraduate Wake Forest students, mostly juniors and sophomores. Though I had planned to teach this class way in advance, teaching this content during this time in the USA was extremely terrifying for me as a migrant who does not have recognized citizenship within the USA. But I am committed to this work, and therefore I remain steadfast. The final project for this class asked students to examine gender and migration in the Caribbean using an environmental justice lens. During the class, I taught students about the importance of learning about environmental catastrophe within the Caribbean, especially because of our extractive relations with the global north, the lasting harms of capitalism and imperialism, especially that coming from the US, and of course because of other social, economic, and geographic conditions, quite literally because of where we are located. Students also engage with climate justice guest lectures from the Caribbean, 2 in particular, and they learned how actions in the West impact countries, communities, families, and individuals within the Caribbean. For the final assignment, students were invited to explore the lived experiences of climate refugees in the region, focusing on 4 hurricanes that had occurred within the last 8 years and affected places such as Puerto Rico, Dominica, the Bahamas, and Antigua and Barbuda, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, always, yeah. These hurricanes were selected because of the intensity of the disasters and, of course, the lessons that we can learn. And as we continue to think about how these hurricanes and these disasters impact the most vulnerable, the class assignment focused on women, children, and working class people. I provided all of the resources and guided them through how to access, first of all, Caribbean-based news sources, instead of focusing on those that came from the global north. And this is a lesson for the classroom. This practice we learned helped us to decenter the West and decenter the USA. And as the students had shared, it made them realize how limited their access to news was, as they only relied on large news networks within the US to know about the rest of the world. So they followed these guidelines that I've just briefly placed on the slides for you. They worked in groups of 3, and they developed maps about the migration journeys of those who were impacted by hurricanes within the region. They focused on stories of survival and of mainly women's journeys and family journeys. And I will highlight 3 of those assignments very quickly. The first group looked at the journey of Maria. Maria had to leave the US Virgin Islands and decided to move to Boston, of all places, where she had no family, no friends, no community. This became specifically surprising to the students because they learned that the US Virgin Islands is a colony of the US in 2025. They also learned that Americans who lived there had the ability to leave before the hurricane hit and had the option to return to the mainland USA, while those who lived in the US Virgin Islands, who were residents, who were mostly Black, did not have that choice, and they were required to shelter in place. They learned that the USVI residents can, however, live within the United States. And so Maria's choice to move to Boston, of all places, was one that she made because she thought she would have a better life here than her life remaining in the USVI. The second group mapped a migration journey of Corita. She's a 34-year-old mother of two who left Dominica to move to St. Lucia. Students were very focused on the ways her gender impacted the decisions she made to move, especially as she was fully responsible for her family. And the students got to learn about this very small English-speaking Caribbean country called Dominica, who many of them had never heard about before and were actually confusing with the Dominican Republic. The final group looked at two migrant stories very distinctly, and this addressed issues of race, class, and gender. They explored the different experiences of Kyrie and Gloria. Kyrie is a white man who is a UK citizen living in the British Virgin Islands when his family had an opportunity to return to United Kingdom before the storm hit through a repatriation flight. They then looked at Gloria, who is a Black single mother with 8 children who had to leave Barbuda to move to Antigua for safety with no options for repatriation because that is where she was from. These narratives for the students revealed how migrant status provides more options for you to move, especially in cases of environmental catastrophe, but also how it causes displacement for those who have limited options for their own survival. Teaching and engaging with the students through this project was something that I enjoyed doing, but particularly because I watched them become educated and learn about how multiple ways in which climate catastrophe impacts those that we often don't think about, especially those who are vulnerable. And I watched them question how we can ensure that there are increased protections and plans for climate refugees around the world. The second part of my work, and I'm almost done, focuses on development of a documentary in Guyana on this flower. This flower is called the Victoria Regia lily. It is the national flower of Guyana. We call it at home the water lily. And while it is found across our country in various parts, in the capital city where I live, the plant grows in waterways and also in the streams around our coastal region. And this lily is more than an aquatic plant. It holds for us at home deep cultural, spiritual, and ecological significance. Indigenous communities, for example, in Guyana has about 17% of people who are indigenous to the region. They use it for medicinal purposes. Our Hindus in Guyana use it for religious practices. The flower is also used among our Afro-Guyanese community for ceremonial practices as well as to make jewelry and for beautification. Despite this significant importance of this plant, there is now in Guyana large-scale infrastructural projects, including road expansions, that are leading to the removal of this plant in our rivers, our ponds, and our wetlands. And for those of you who don't know, the context of this development, as they refer to it, is because we have just found one of the world's largest sources of oil in our country. And so ExxonMobil is now leading the charge at home to develop this oil. And that means that our ecosystem is dying. This raises extremely important questions for us as citizens of Guyana. For what is the trade-off between development and ecological preservation? And I note for this project that my work does not see development as markers of high-rise buildings and bigger roads, but are focused more to the land. So I took this picture when I was home at Christmas to give a sense of how they're filling the dams. These dams were once filled with lilies. They're filling the dams and expanding the roads to, create more space. While the expansion of roads may be important and what the government calls economic growth, It simultaneously disrupts our ecosystem, displaces our plant life, and diminishes our resources that are relied upon for various communities. So this documentary that I am working on with a producer in Guyana will explore the cultural, spiritual, and environmental significance of the water lily in Guyana. It will gather the stories of those who are directly impacted by it. I will be conducting interviews with Indigenous people, with the Hindu community, and with Afro-Guyanese who incorporate the plant into their traditions to document the importance of it in our everyday life. By weaving these narratives together, the documentary explores different cultural heritage and the difference between that and modernization, and centers the discussion of how development can be pursued while we preserve our life and our livelihood. And this documentary will be completed in early 2026. I want to say a special thank you to the EEJI team for providing me the resources and the funding to be able to do this very meaningful work. And when the documentary is ready, I'm happy to share it with you and to host a screening here at Wake Forest University. Thank you so much.
I am Dr. Claire B. Crawford. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs in the program of African American Studies. And thank you for this opportunity, because at first when I was made a fellow, I was just like, what do I do that includes the environment? And so it really challenged me. A lot of my work focuses around Black sound and the freedom that is in Black sound. And so really weaving that through both my classes, my students' work, and my work is what we'll go through a little bit today. And so really thinking about this project as broadly hearing freedom in our soundscape. And so first motivated by all my work by the question that Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan raised is, how can you know the political, social, and economic range of a community if you don't know how they signature their identity with their soundings? And so by soundings here, usually we think of it as a marine biology term, right, about the depth of something, like what that actually means and going deeper into the ocean. But here, there's also the meaning of literally like, what does your community sound like? And what meaning does that provide? And of course, she is also known for being one of the co-founders of Sweet Honey in the Rock, but mainly in my work, she shows up as an original SNCC freedom singer in Albany, Georgia, which I'll end with a little bit of. So in my classes, starting with the fall when I first found out about this, I teach a class called Black Southern Organizing and Sound in the fall. And mainly what we do is we take a sonic journey through the civil rights movement. But two main assignments that really came up and helped, and these funds helped me to push the students a little bit more. One, they keep a sound journal. And so here's some pieces of like what that sound journal looks like. I asked them to write at least like twice a week, a little bit. And so in the beginning, it kind of starts off like, I heard a bird. But then by like the end of the semester, it's just like the quiet, low chirps, right? So we start getting into really like, do you know what your environment sounds like and how important that is? And then last, one of the big assignments that they do is they actually do an entire soundscape assignment. And so one thing that's important about soundscapes, not only are they made by like literally what it sounds like, but they're framed politically. We know as we enter certain political times, music changes. We know that people talk differently, right? Not even just in the use of words, but how people talk. They might whisper more when they think something might be threatened. So like how important that is. And for them to pick up on that. So they would revisit one spot over 5 times at different times, recording 2 minutes to 10 minutes, and really then jot first what they heard with their own ear, and then what is on the recording. In my second class from this spring, I taught a class on Black arts in the Americas for African American Studies. And so this was Black feminism and sound is kind of how I taught the course. And so we dealt a lot with mainstream Black women performers. And to be honest, I'm only a young millennial, but they were young Gen Z. And so as much as I wanted to make this a sound theory class, it turned into more of a musical history moment. And so one of the biggest things that they did, it was only 5 students. They made about an hour, 30-minute here, as you can kind of see this clip here, of a soundtrack of kind of like their own playlists that they put together. And so even like in the making of our own soundscapes as being important. And then last but not least, I had the opportunity as well this spring to teach an Africana political philosophy class. And this semester, I themed it under Afro-Caribbean thinkers. And with the guidance from Dr. Leslie Straker, I think I saw him here earlier, like he came to the class, and then in between basically reading On Violence by Fanon, and then, of course, like Winter's Understanding of Humanity, we kind of had this moment about thinking about the environment, right? Like, so man as human, but then is humanity also living And so am I no more better than the leaf, than the bug, than the concrete that's man-made? Like, how do I think about myself? And so they gave actual presentations for one day, thinking and considering that. And then another thing that I did get to do this, I had to get to do an event this past semester sponsored by the Slavery Erased Memory Project, focusing more on my work called the Freedom Dreams Mass Meeting, as I attempt to try to bring back the idea of mass meetings in the spirit of the civil rights movement, reorchestrating it in a different type of way. And so I was actually able to bring the Albany Civil Rights Institute Freedom Singers from Albany, Georgia, with a living member of the SNCC Freedom Singers, Rutha Mae Harris, who's still alive. She's 85. She's kind of seated in the chair. And we actually hosted this in the Haynes Art Gallery during their Young, Gifted, and Black exhibit. And so if sound plays, let's see if we can get a little sound here. And so also as a part of that moment, we ended kind of in a way differently because we're in the present, but thinking about what other ways can we also incorporate the environment. So I got the opportunity to work with Reverend Joshua Campbell, the director of music in the Divinity School. And so he had this brilliant idea that these programs that we printed are also actually on seed paper. And so they were printed on wildflower seed paper, and we asked people to write their freedom dreams at the bottom. And so either give them back to us, which we did collect some, or to take them home with you and literally plant your freedom dream, and it will create something. And so then moving on even more, thinking about students who I've been working with. So some kind of way, I've been busy this semester, but Lexi Smith, I did an independent study with her, and she really worked at this Black women's political behavior for politics and international affairs, where we actually interviewed several different Black student groups here, and as focus groups to really think about, like, what does it sound like on this campus to talk about politics? So that's been really interesting. So to see what she produces this summer, I'll be working with Michelle Gong as she does something really interesting as well. She's from Little Rock, Arkansas, and she actually went to Central High School, which we know is famous for the Little Rock 9 integration. And so what she plans on doing is actually thinking about the space, the literal space of being at Central High, and how that actually connects from like what it looked like during the Little Rock 9 as militarized, and then even thinking of herself going to the school and graduating in like 2020, and the same militarization that is now mostly a Black and brown school. So literally thinking about the shift in the education policy, but the space that it created, but how it feels the same because of the militarization. And then last but not least, I'll be working with Chase in August. We're gonna go back to her grandparents' hometown of Martinsville and Danville, Virginia, where we will literally be recording places of memory, but only sonically because they're no longer there. So sort of these like Black spaces that have disappeared. This comes from an idea that she asked her grandparents, like, what were they listening to growing up? And they talked about this place called Club Paradise. And so that's why it's called Remembering Paradise, because Paradise is no longer there. And so we're actually gonna go to these spaces, play the type of music that was there, get people in the community to come and reimagine sonically what that space was like. And last but not least, my own work. I have an article coming out in Southern Cultures in their special Hip Hop South issue called Murmurs to Mumbles, where I basically take my own sort of sonic journey connecting Outkast to the murmurs that are in the souls of Black folks for W.B. Du Bois. And then last but not least, as I go on my own research leave, connecting it back to my work as I work on my book project, So the Devil Doesn't Hear You, Rural Black Southern Political Existences as the Otherwise. I go back to Albany, Georgia, thinking about the Albany movement as a place from which we can reimagine a musical democracy. And so just to give you a little taste of what my musical democracy sounds like. And so thank you to the EEJI for really supporting this work, as I consider sound as being a part of our living, things that we must keep alive. And so for me, it starts with the hum, that felt sound, that first thing that's in your body. And so sound is spiritual, resistant, and challenging, and also complex and worth being a part of our environment. So thank you all again.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you. My name's Dan Henry. I'm an assistant teaching professor in the Department of African American Studies and the program of Leadership and Character. First, I want to express my gratitude for the support I've received from EEJI and also the opportunity to learn from you all here today and my fellow panelists. So this is the project I pursued here is a chapter from a book manuscript I'm working on called Citizens Without Sovereignty. And the chapter I'm going to discuss today is called Environmental Racism and Democratic Solidarity. I should have noted, but it's not really represented here in these slides at least, that all of this research is, of course, intimately related to some of the teaching I'm doing this semester in the class on Black Lives Matter and FYS I'm offering this semester. The final unit includes a lot of readings and discussions of questions of environmental justice, which is going to be, it'll be very clear how that's related to my research in just a moment. So our era's accelerating environmental crises pose distinct democratic challenges. Spanning the local, national, and planetary scales, all of humanity has a stake in them. And yet, far from leveling pre-existing hierarchies, the looming environmental crises our planet faces in fact derive from, and indeed exacerbate, the colonial forms of domination and deprivation characterizing our world system, individual states, and local communities. As Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor have recently described, far from leading to a moment of international solidarity, the era of climate disaster has instead led to the rise of movements across the West seeking to position their, quote, relatively wealthy states as armed bunkers. To put it bluntly, they write, the most powerful people in the world are preparing for the end of the world, an end they themselves are frenetically accelerating. This image, I couldn't think of a better image for this theme than maybe some of you remember 2015 Senator Imhoff from Oklahoma bringing a snowball onto the floor of the Senate to disprove climate change. The governing logic of American political economy in this context is, as many critics have noted, to treat disenfranchised and dispossessed communities in the United States and abroad as disposable. And while this is certainly the mentality animating American elites, like the libertarian seasteaders profiled in a recent New York Times piece who seek to build floating castles staffed with armed guards. This is the image on the left is of Rudiger Koch. I don't know if anyone read that profile from last week. He's got a sort of an underwater home in international waters. It's just him. He's like a billionaire, and then there's an armed guard at the top who's not a billionaire. So sounds like a bad idea, but what can you do? This is also a broader democratic problem. I've juxtaposed this image up here with one of a 2019 protests by residents of Cancer Alley in Louisiana who are gathering on the steps of the Capitol in Baton Rouge. The support of millions for a war on immigrants and immigration is not separate from a lack of broad-based support for global solidarity in the face of the climate crisis, nor is support for policies that poison the environments of Black and Latino communities separate from support by a broad spectrum of the public for measures that disenfranchise and punish those same individuals and communities. What Charles Mills called America's Herrenvolk democracy, a democracy in which whites have a primary share of the sovereignty, serves as an important precondition of its domestic and international environmental injustices. And looking forward, as a number of critics have recently argued, this same lack of solidarity will leave open the possibility of ever more authoritarian efforts to preserve natural resources and political power for wealthier, whiter, and more enfranchised segments of the American public, along with punishment, surveillance, and austerity for the vast majority of humanity. I think back to the comment I think it was William Barber made during our first panel on the ways, for example, a language of DEI has been used to disqualify environmental justice. This is very much in keeping with the broad logic of, again, what Mills called a Herrenvolk democracy. So as an EEJI fellow, I've been studying with the expert research assistants of a student of ours, Naya Bryant, who's graduating this year, the environmental connections and implications of the movement for Black lives. Specifically, I'm interested in the ways that intellectuals and activists of the movement for Black lives offer ways of understanding democracy that serve as an alternative to the exclusionary and extractive ethos I just mentioned. This is a project of philosophical reconstruction rather than an explicit doctrine adopted by all activists, but it is one I think is attentive to the statements and actions taken by the organizations that comprise the kind of broader movement for Black lives over the past decade. A second note, I'm using the term movement for Black lives because I'm describing the movements kind of very, very broadly to include efforts of specific organizations that include Black Lives Matter, Black Youth Project 100, and others, but also the broader world of intellectuals and activists, many of whom preceded the movement and continue to contest policing and incarceration. At the core of this account is an ethic of solidarity, one that at once transcends the boundaries of any one national community while still remaining attentive to the specificity of local struggles. Probably the clearest example of this ethic has been the movement's international solidarity against forms of policing, incarceration, and militarism. We saw this in the movement's solidarity work with Palestine. Activists drew a connection between the forms of violence, surveillance, militarized policing, and occupation and incarceration that also threatened Black communities in the United States. In making this connection, they drew on the thesis going back a century of Black life in the United States as that of an internal colony subject to the dominative and extractive aims of the U.S. state and white communities, including, importantly for our purposes, the dangerous dumping of pollutants, the denial of clean air and water, dispossession and demolition of housing and community institutions, among others. Importantly, as Nadine Naber writes, the connections activists and intellectuals have made in this regard are not just claims of a parallel. Ferguson is not just like Gaza, she says. Rather, they make the claim that the fate of Gaza and Ferguson residents are linked by the same structures. This includes, for instance, the ways American funding for policing and military in the U.S. and for the Israeli state come at the expense of resources desperately needed by impoverished communities in both countries. It also includes, famously, Israel's training of American police departments. But linked fate is ultimately insufficient to explain the account of solidarity these activists offer, as Mark Lamont Hill has recently argued. As important as it is for motivating solidarity, it does not necessarily attend to the specificity of oppression faced in a complex world. After all, as Naomi Klein and Asher Taylor note, just to loop back to them again, the closing of borders to the rest of humanity is a means of denying linked fate. Rather, solidarity also needs a moral core. The movement for Black lives offers this in its philosophy of value, represented most famously by the phrase Black Lives Matter. Activists point to the equal value of human life and the equal value of Black life specifically as a means to identify the devaluing forms of domination and dispossession characterizing the systems they critique. These systems are at once local, national, and planetary. More than a form of critique, however, the movement's value claims also offer ideals of what sort of world valuing Black life and the lives of other marginalized people could bring about. I like to ask my students in our class on Black Lives Matter, if you were to imagine a world founded on this view, what would it look like? I want to be careful here. Obviously, this phrase refers to something very specific, right? It's meant to relate to Black lives specifically. I'm not trying to claim that the philosophy I describe is a deviation from this. Rather, I want to suggest that it's also a generative philosophy that offers critical tools and new horizons in our moment. Patrice Cullors, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, recently described such a horizon and her effort to think through our era of what she calls a planetary crisis. Needed, she says, in an interview collected in this volume, Policing the Planet, which is very good. is a global democratic vision. I will end here with her statement. She writes, "I think an abolitionist society is a society that has no borders, literally. It's a society that's based on interdependence and the connection of all living beings. It's a society that is determined to facilitate a life that is full of respect, a life that is full of honoring and praising those most impacted by oppression." Thank you so much.
My name is Khaliah Reed. While this is setting up, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Khaliah Reed. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. However, my background is in literature and literary fandom, so I wanted to approach this idea of crisis and environmental justice from that perspective, and think about how literature and creative writing can be used to tackle these ideas, particularly for those that don't feel perhaps that they are equipped to do this sort of work. So like the young, those without community, or those who perceive they don't have community, and overall those who just feel what they have to offer is envisioning and creation. So today I'm just gonna give you a little bit of background about my project and my results. Okay, so we all are existing in this current state, so you know it's a bit of a mess. In this time marked by anxiety, that includes environmental degradation, job insecurity, rising financial burdens, I looked particularly at dystopian and post-apocalyptic fan fiction. And if you're not aware of what fan fiction is, these are works that are created by fans that extend, alter, or reimagine pre-existing media. So including books, movies, songs, TV shows, video games, there really is no limit. And I look at how this particular type of fan fiction has become a medium through which writers are able to process and cope with the anxieties and issues that we're seeing unfold in real time. They are not only echoing what is a collective unease about the present, but they're also imagining the future with either a cautious optimism or a resigned pessimism. My research project examines how fan fiction writers specifically embed their concerns into these dystopian narratives that they're writing, and how they use fan fiction as a way to reflect on complex social and environmental issues that we're facing in this time period. So I looked at 15 fan fiction stories across 10 different fandoms, and what I'm looking at it would be a gross overstatement to say this applies to all fan fiction, but there are many common themes present in this particular subgenre of fan fiction, and that was what was under examination in this project. Some of these stories come from 10 different fandoms, and these include Les Miserables, Avatar, The Hunger Games, The Last of Us, Black Panther, and Wonder Woman, and among others. So before I go even further, I've been throwing this fan fiction term around, but there's another term I want to define as well. So like I said, fan fiction is writing that takes characters, settings, plot lines, and so on from a chosen source text and uses them to create new works. I like to give the example, if you've all seen the movie Titanic, what if Jack had lived? That means fan fiction is to then go on to write that story of what that would look like. So you also want to keep in mind that this is a transformative process. It's not simply just copying, but reinterpreting, critiquing, and sometimes radically altering the source text to explore new ideas or perspectives. The second term that is useful in my research is civic imagination, which involves envisioning alternatives to current cultural, social, political, or economic realities. The first step toward change is imagining a better world, but the civic imagination goes a bit further, asking what would it take to make that world real? By examining dystopian and apocalyptic fan fiction through the lens of the civic imagination, I'm arguing that these fan fiction writers are not only reflecting existing concerns, but are actively engaging in an imaginative process that explores potential futures and alternative to our current and perhaps failing societal structures. But why fan fiction and not original fiction? Well, I'm a fan fiction writer, so perhaps I'm biased. I don't know. But fan fiction's inherently transformative nature makes it especially powerful and equipped to engage with ideas about the future, whether through the form of dystopia, post-apocalypse, or utopia. It's also very subversive because fan fiction often rewrites or reinterprets pre-existing source text. It has the ability to challenge dominant narratives. In that sense, it can be a creative space for resistance. It's also more flexible than mainstream media narratives tend to be. Importantly, it lowers the stakes, and that is particularly important when doing this type of thinking. When writers are working with an existing world or familiar characters, it can feel a bit less intimidating to explore difficult or even traumatic themes. And plus, the scaffolding is already there, so they can use that time instead to focus on the emotional and political work they want to do rather than world building, even though some writers do invest in that as well. Another reason is that fan fiction comes with an immediate community. Writers aren't just creating in a vacuum, they're posting in spaces where there's sometimes immediate feedback, conversation, and solidarity. And finally, fan fiction, and this is one of its sort of claims to fame, is that it can be an act of reclamation. It's not just a case of playing in someone's playground. It more often than not is rewriting the rules entirely. Many mainstream media narratives tend to fumble or avoid many social concerns in these narratives. Fan fiction writers can rewrite these stories, filling in the gaps, challenging problematic tropes, and even centering characters that were otherwise sidelined or marginalized. In that sense, fan fiction is not only creative, but also corrective. So what did I find? I said I reviewed 15 stories. So there are many recurring themes, and I'm not gonna talk about all of them. I'll go into detail about a few of them. But the main themes that came up in these stories were environmental collapse, unbreathable air or just questionable air quality, resource scarcity, radiation, corporate greed, drug dependency, disease and virus. And then I also tracked how they approach the idea of the future, whether through a lens of hope or hopelessness. Like I said, I'm not going to go into detail about all of them, but I'll go into a few. Environmental collapse, which was in 12 of the 15 stories, was a particularly easy theme to trace because, like I said, it was in most of the stories. Many of these stories depict the Earth as unrecognizable, so it's either poisoned or overheated, and in some cases on the brink of not existing anymore. And it was very interesting to see how writers depicted nature as its own character that wasn't just background, but almost an antagonistic force that was fighting back against the humans in the story who served as an avatar of the humans that endangered the Earth in the first place. In these stories, nature is no longer passive, but reactive. And of course, along with that was resource scarcity, which was in 6 of the 15 stories. Another notable theme was air quality, or the lack of access to good breathing air. And it was interesting to see how the writers positioned the idea of air quality as a marker of inequality and decay. So some characters were able to live with unbreathable air by being in these siloed areas, domes, particular towns, but a lot of the main characters were those that were left to exist in these wastelands. One story in particular dealt with the idea of dust and how breathing in dust became a death sentence, but the main characters were forced to live in these wastelands where dust was in the air. There was also radiation, which signaled the long-term impact of human-made catastrophe. And I thought it was particularly humorous, perhaps humorous is not the correct word, to read how the characters were left with almost a bitter resentment of the pre-apocalypse societies that have led to the world that they're existing in. Corporate greed was in 7 of the 15 stories, as well as drug dependency, which I did not expect to pop up as often as it did. In these stories, the characters are numbing themselves to survive, and drugs become not only a vice, but a way to cope with an unthinkable and sometimes untenable future. And interestingly, it usually started as a prescription to deal with disease brought about by the current environmental conditions. And of course, 9 of the 15 take a hopeful approach, while 6 of the 15 are pretty bleak and sort of end in either the annihilation of all the characters or a really sad fade to black ending. I just have a few more points and then I'll wrap up. Beyond analyzing the text itself, I also interviewed 17 Black women who write fan fiction, and I really wanted to understand why are they drawn to dystopian or post-apocalyptic narratives, how their real-world anxieties are showing up in their stories, and how they see fan fiction as a way to process or resist the challenges of the real world. Because I can read these stories and, conjecture about all of the motivations that went into writing them, but I also wanted to speak to people doing this writing to see if perhaps my hunch was what people were actually feeling. There were several motivations shared across the writers. Some describe fan fiction as a safe testing ground for imagining societal collapse. So one writer, she said, we create based on our lived experiences, so why not use a familiar medium to speculate about the future? Others, I should say, more than one, emphasized using familiar characters to hold onto hope while envisioning these darker futures. She said fan fiction can be incredibly political. Once we put down, the coffee shop alternative universe stories and stuff like that, there are people who want to write very interesting things about stuff like the environment. Whether people are going to always be brave enough to do that is something else. Several interviewees emphasized that working with existing worlds made it easier to explore deeply personal or political themes, and for time, I'll skip that quote. Some writers describe fan fiction as a space where they can explore or exist in optimism, even if they in their real lives don't experience it. This writer particularly, she said, honestly, I'm way more hopeful in fic than I am in real life. Like real life just feels heavy. So of course, I'm gonna write that nice ending for my character. I don't know, when I write that, I can go back to it and see the character with the nice ending on my roughest days, even if it's just pretend. So just to wrap up, I kind of full speed ahead through the project. I can go into more detail later if you have other questions, but what's interesting to me about this particular fan fiction is that it's not just escapism. A lot of fan fiction can be escapism, but there's something that motivates what type of fan fiction you write. Many fan fiction stories exist in that spirit of the civic imagination. And these stories, like I said, aren't just escapism. They are speculative acts of not only critique, but also resistance and care. Care not only about themselves and their communities, but about the future communities. What will the world look like in 10, 20, 100 years? In imagining worlds torn apart by collapse, fan fiction writers are also imagining how people survive, how they fight back, in some cases, how they succumb to these issues. It gives writers the space to ask, what if things were different? And more importantly, gives them the space to explore that question on their own terms. And this is my last slide. I want to continue this. I want to analyze more stories, interview more people, but more importantly, I want to turn this into a writing workshop geared toward younger people, those that know of fan fiction and those that don't. And the goal is to use fan fiction as a tool, particularly for young people, to imagine alternative futures and, more importantly, to feel a sense of investment and agency in shaping or resisting those possible outcomes. So thank you. I want to say thank you to EEJI, which catalyzed this work. I had the idea in the back of my mind for a while, but I'm an academic, so of course I don't do what I'm supposed to do. So thank you very much for that, as well as thank you for the funds that allowed me to interview the people I did. Sometimes academia can be very extractive, particularly in these communities, and I appreciated you giving me the funds to be able to offer them some compensation for speaking to me. So thank you very much.
Glorious end to hear these very innovative and exciting projects done by our faculty fellows. I was like, wow, I never would have thought of that. So this is really great and kind of uplifting. A lot of it is very uplifting, even though they're telling us these traumatic stories in some cases. But that concludes our second annual Environmental Justice Summit. And we hope to see most of you or all of you here next year and the year after that. And so that concludes our day. Please, we end it at this time so that those who want to can go to the, there's an awards ceremony for the, let's see, the people from the Office of Sustainability to the people, they're giving tribute to some of the sustainability leaders who've done great work on campus, and that's at the Reynolds Center. Next door is called Champions of Change Award winners. And so they'll be announced next door if anybody wants to go and see and continue this celebration of sustainability and change in Earth Month. So thank you all again for coming. Have a great day.